Well, hello everybody. Mike Prevost here from MikePrevost.com, and today I want to share with you my experience on the ketogenic diet. I did some advanced lipid testing, which makes the data kind of interesting. I did a classic ketogenic diet. I followed the basic guidance of Volek and Finney from their book, The Art of Low Carbohydrate Living, and was on a ketogenic diet for about 4.5 months and decided to go in for some lipid testing and got some pretty interesting results, and then did some follow-on manipulation of my carbohydrate intake and some more lipid testing and got some more interesting results. So I'm going to share that with you today. But before I get into the lipid results, I'm going to explain to you a little bit about the advanced lipid testing that I did. What does it mean and what confers risks, so that when we look at my numbers, everything makes sense. Okay, fair enough. So this is notional or example lipid testing, and we're pretending like we tested Jack and Jill, and we were measuring their blood lipids, and we're focusing right now on LDL-C. LDL-C is LDL concentration. LDL stands for low density lipoprotein, which is the so-called bad cholesterol, and HDL, or high density lipoprotein, is the so-called good cholesterol. So we see in this case that both Jack and Jill have LDL-C value of 130 milligrams per deciliter. And if all of their other blood lipids are the same, and we were weighing risk between those two individuals, we would probably say that their risk of cardiovascular disease is equal. But there's something interesting I'm going to point out in a minute. In this case with LDL-C, we know how much cholesterol they're carrying, but we don't know how they're carrying that cholesterol, that LDL cholesterol, and how you carry that LDL cholesterol turns out is very important. So now we're peeking inside of the container for Jack and Jill, and we're looking to see how they actually carry that LDL cholesterol. We see something interesting. So even though their LDL cholesterol concentrations are the same, we can see that they're carrying it in a completely different way, right? So we look at Jill's here, and Jill's carrying her LDL cholesterol in lots of little particles, okay? And Jack, well, just a few large particles. That's a pretty big difference. So cholesterol in our body is carried in lipoprotein particles. It's kind of like a container, a storage container for cholesterol. You can think of it that way. And what we're going to see later when I show you some data is that the more particles you have, the more risk you have. And so it's the particle number more so than the concentration. So it's particle number more so than the concentration that confers risk. So let's look at another example with Jack and Jill. And let's suppose in this case now we tested their LDL-C, their LDL concentration, and we got different values. So in this case, Jack had a higher LDL-C than Jill did. But let's also suppose that we tested their particle number, their LDL particle number, what's called LDL-P. LDL-P. We tested their LDL-P, and their LDL-P was the same. So would Jack be at increased risk because although his LDL-P is the same as Jill's, his LDL-C is higher? Is he at increased risk, or does LDL-P carry all of the risk? Well, I can tell you that it's not 100% conclusive yet, but as the data comes in, it's really starting to point towards the answer being yes, that they probably do have the same risk, that almost all of the risk is carried in the LDL-P number rather than the LDL-C number. Okay, let's look at some data. This is some data often presented by Jim Oakvos, and it's from the Framingham Offspring Prospective Cohort and the Mesa trial. Okay, so those two studies. And the reference is right down here. Okay, I don't want you to look at the graph yet. Let's focus right here on this green box for a minute. So I really want you to understand this concept. LDL-C is a concentration in milligrams per deciliter. It's like a total amount of LDL cholesterol carried. It's an amount. LDL-P, though, is not a concentration. It's a count of the number of particles. So it tells us how that LDL-C is carried. LDL-P tells us how the LDL-C is carried. And it's a number in nanomoles per liter, which is a count. Okay? Now let's look over at the chart. At the top, we have LDL-C. At the bottom, we have LDL-P. And these are frequency distributions. So let's look at an interesting thing about these frequency distributions. There's a relationship between LDL-C and LDL-P that is kind of convenient, really. So let's start at the top at an LDL-C value of 130 milligrams per deciliter, and we go straight down and we have 1300 nanomoles per liter. At the top, 160, we go straight down, we have 1600. At the top, 190, we go straight down, we have 1900. So I think you can start to see a trend here, and the trend is when LDL-C and LDL-P are what we call concordant, when they're increasing and decreasing together in a specific pattern or a predictable way, that's concordance. Well, when that happens, we can predict LDL-P by simply adding a 0 to LDL-C. So if your LDL-P value is 140, LDL-C value is 140, then we would predict your LDL-P to be 1400. That's when you're concordant. I'm going to show you later that not everyone is concordant, though. Now this has another implication, and the other implication is we can sort of interpret LDL-P like an LDL-C with an extra 0. So we know we want your LDL-C to be less than 100. So what would that mean in terms of a goal for LDL-P? Well, we add a 0, right? So we'd want your LDL-P to be less than 1000. So in general, LDL-P values of less than 1000 are desirable. That's where we want to be. So let's talk about concordance and discordance. So I talked about concordance a little bit. Let's focus on the center box right here for a minute. Okay, so we have an LDL-C value of 120 milligrams per deciliter. If we're concordant, we should have an LDL-P value of approximately 1200 nanomoles per liter, right? So 120, you know, we add 0 and we get 1200. That's concordance. All right, so let's go to the top box now. And let's say that we measured LDL-C at 120, and then we measured LDL-P, and instead of getting 1200, we got 800. Now remember I mentioned that LDL-P carries risk. A larger particle count equals more risk. In this case, well, it's less risky than we would expect. We're carrying our LDL-C in a less risky way than we expected. So we're discordant because LDL-C and LDL-P are not, LDL-P is not simply, you know, adding a 0 to the LDL-C value. It's significantly different. We're discordant, but in a good direction, because it confers less risk, right? So that's discordant but good. Down to the bottom box, again, we measure, let's say we measured 120 milligrams per deciliter, and instead of being, you know, 1200, we measured it and we got 1900. It's greater than we expected. Well, that's more risk than we anticipated based on the LDL-C. It's discordant, but in a bad direction. So that's discordant but bad. Okay? So we have concordant, discordant but good, and discordant but bad. And all of those are possible. Now down here at the bottom, you know, this discordant but bad is more common in people that have insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. Discordant but bad. In a later video, I'll explain why that happens. There's some things that go on with some specific enzymes and lipoproteins that shift the particle count in a bad way. But suffice it to say right now that one of the issues with insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes is we end up discordant but bad. That's a real problem because your LDL cholesterol could look normal or even really good when you have a particle count that's really high. And so it looks like you're not at risk when you actually are. And that can lead to physicians missing really risky lipoprotein particle count profiles. So let's look at some data from the Framingham Offspring cohort trial. And we're going to look at this graph to the right. And let's orient ourselves to the graph a little bit, right? So the vertical axis here is probability of event-free survival. And event-free survival means, well, that you survived without events. And events in this case are cardiovascular events, major cardiovascular events like heart attack and stroke. So a low probability of survival that's higher is better, right? And so we have, you can see we have 4 lines there, and the higher lines are the better lines. You want to be in the higher survival rate. And the lower lines are the worst lines. You don't want to be in the lower survival rate. Make sense? Okay. So I want to focus on LDL-C for a minute. And we're going to look at where LDL-C falls on these lines, which lines are high and which lines are low. And we're going to see something kind of interesting. So let's start here. So on one of the good lines, we have low LDL-C. And that makes sense. If your LDL cholesterol or the bad cholesterol is low, you should have high survival, right? But also, let's look at the other good line. Well, we have high LDL-C. So in our 2 high survival lines, we have low LDL-C and high LDL-C. So it's a little contradictory. Well, let's go down to the low survival lines. Well, we have high LDL-C. Well, that kind of makes sense, but then we also have low LDL-C. Well, I think you can see that LDL-C is not doing a very good job of predicting event-free survival, because you can have high or low LDL-C and have high survival or low survival. It's just not predicting it at all. So let's then shift our attention to LDL-P, okay? So on the high survival line here, on the high survival line, we have low LDL-P. On the other high survival line, we have a low LDL-P. Okay, so that's pretty good. That's consistent, right? And on the low survival line, we have high LDL-P and high LDL-P. So what we notice with these data are that when LDL-P is low, people have a higher survival rate. When LDL-P is high, they have a lower survival rate. So unlike LDL-C, LDL-P is a measure that always tracks in the right direction. And it's so overall, then LDL-P is a much better predictor of event-free survival or cardiovascular disease or mortality, right? So LDL-P is just a much, much better measure. So when people say cholesterol is not related to heart disease, etc., they're really only talking about LDL-C. When it comes to LDL-P, it actually is a pretty good predictor of heart disease. Last thing I'll point out on this slide is that not everybody's concordant, right? So here we have LDL-C is high and LDL-P is high, so these people are concordant, okay? And here we have LDL-C is low and LDL-P is low, so those people are concordant, okay? Here we have LDL-C is high, but LDL-P is low. So these people right here, they're discordant but good. And here we have LDL-C is low, but LDL-P is high. So these folks would be discordant but bad. These are the people that with standard cholesterol testing would look like they're not at risk at all, you know, but in fact, they really are at risk because their LDL-P is high. Okay, so now that we've explained all that, we'll get to my lipid numbers and show you some interesting results from my experience with the ketogenic diet. So this is my 21-year lipid testing history. I was on flight status in the Navy for 21 years as an aerospace physiologist. And so I had a flight physical every year with a lipid panel. And the numbers you see here are a range. They're the lowest value in that 21-year period, and the highest value in that 21-year period. Okay, so it's a range of my values. And you can see here, they're pretty good. So total cholesterol, you know, 109 to 130. Nobody's going to complain about that. That's pretty low. LDL cholesterol, really good. 55 to 66, great. You know, HDL could be a little higher, but it's not a big deal, especially in light of my low LDLs. Triglycerides look good, you know, and blood glucose is normal. So that's my range. You can see it's very consistent. Didn't really change much over a 21-year period. In fact, some of the better numbers are near the end of that 21-year period. Well, now these are my values after 4.5 months on the ketogenic diet, and I want you to notice a couple things right away. One is that my total cholesterol pretty much doubled. My LDL cholesterol almost tripled. That's a pretty big increase. I could tell you my doctor was really surprised or shocked to see those numbers, especially that given the stable history of my blood lipids over a 21-year period. HDLs and triglycerides look fine. But interestingly, I got the highest blood glucose value that I had gotten in 21 years. It's not that elevated, and typically I run a little bit high in the morning, so my fasting blood glucose is higher in the morning than it is throughout the rest of the day. And if you Google that, you'll see that there's a circadian rhythm effect that happens in some people called the dawn phenomenon, and I think I'm probably one of those dawn phenomenon people, so I'm not too worried about that value. So here's a comparison side by side, my normal 21-year history values in keto, and you can see the big jump in total and the big jump in LDL cholesterol, and why that was such a big issue. It's a pretty big increase. So I was concerned about this, obviously, and decided at that point I wanted to go in and do some advanced lipid testing, get some LDL-P testing done, because I knew it was possible that I could be discordant but good. So it could be that my LDL-C went way up, but that I had very large particles and not too many of them, and so not really much cardiovascular risk. Remember, the risk is carried in the LDL-P, so I wanted to find out what my LDL-P value was. So here's my results from the LDL-P test. This is about 2 weeks after that cholesterol test that you just saw. And you can see that my LDL-P was 1,448 nanomoles per liter. Okay, and that's a bit elevated. Remember, we want to be less than 1,000. So it's not super high. Once we start getting over 2,000, then we really start to worry. But it's elevated, and I didn't want an elevated LDL-P value. Notice also that my LDL-C had come up a bit more to 176 milligrams per deciliter, and that's a high LDL-C value. Also notice, though, that I'm discordant. So if you look at my LDL-C, if you added a 0, you get 1,760, and my LDL-P is not quite that high. So we would say that I'm discordant, but in the good direction. Okay. This was, on a classic ketogenic diet. My carb intake was less than 50 grams per day. I was measuring urinary ketones and clearly in ketosis. So let's look at a couple of other interesting things from the LDL-P test. My small LDL-P count was 359 nanomoles per liter. That's less than the threshold of 527. And my LDL size was 21, and that's greater than the threshold of 20.5. And so that made me pattern A. Okay, pattern A is large, fluffy LDL particles. Pattern B is small, dense LDL particles. So if you remember, A is good, B for bad. So I was pattern A. So I had a little bit of a dilemma, looking at this. Am I really at increased risk or not? I'm pattern A on the one hand. On the other hand, my LDL-P is elevated. And so does this mean I was at increased risk compared to my normal diet? And really the answer is I'm really not sure, and we just don't know. But we do know that LDL-P carries risk, and so I was concerned. Now my first thought was, well, let me just go back to the way I've always eaten, but I saw an opportunity to gather a little bit of data. And so instead of doing that, I decided to increase my carbohydrate intake to get out of ketosis but remain low carb, test again, and see what direction my blood lipids went in and what happened to my LDL-P. So I increased to 100 to 150 grams of carbohydrates per day, and after about a month I retested. So let's look and see what happened. So here's the results of the retesting, and you can see that clearly my LDL-P went down and my LDL-C went way down. That's a big decrease. Really, it's a pretty substantial decrease in both cases. So at 100 to 150 grams of carbohydrates per day, just adding in a little bit of carbohydrates, my LDL-P came way down and my LDL-C came way down. And you can also notice here that I'm approximately concordant. That's about what you would expect for an LDL-P with an LDL-C, that value. And down here, my LDL-P count and my LDL-P size didn't really change much. There wasn't really a significant change here. So I established then the direction that my blood lipids change, or how my blood lipids change with carbohydrate intake. Clearly, with lower carb and higher fat, my LDL-P increases and my LDL-C decreases. And as I increase my carbohydrate intake, well, the opposite happens. My LDL-P drops and my LDL-C drops. So at this point, I decided it's time to end the experiment, go back to the way I've always eaten, which is somewhere around 40 to 50% of my calories from carbohydrates. And that was right about the time for an annual flight physical. So I went in and got the standard lipid panel done. And let's look and see what happened. So this is after the ketogenic diet, and then after that sort of half-step diet that I did that was low carb but not ketogenic. And then about a little over a month of eating normally again, the way I've always eaten. Went in for a flight physical, got a lipid panel, and here we go. Here's the results. So right back to normal pretty much. My total cholesterol is right back down 116. LDL is right back down to 60. Remember, my LDL had shot up to 176 milligrams per deciliter on the ketogenic diet, and now I'm down to 60. So those are really big drops. Everything else looks good. And this is 40 to 50% of my calories from carbohydrates are greater than 250 grams of carbs per day. Now at this point, I didn't go back in for LDL-P testing for a couple of reasons. One is, well, it was getting a little expensive, to be honest with you. And the other is, I've established that I'm concordant or discordant but good. And so I'm pretty confident in saying that, if I add a 0 here, my LDL-P is probably 600-ish. It could be that it's a little bit higher, but I'm also really confident that it's under 1,000. It's even low carb, with an LDL value over 100, my LDL-P was just a little over 1,000 at about 1,100. So I'm confident I'm under 1,000, and I'm probably closer to 600, which is a good LDL-P value. That's right where you want to be, and it confers low risk. Okay, so let's look at something else that's interesting here. So in the LDL-P test, they calculate something called an insulin resistance marker. And this is my insulin resistance marker score from when I was on the ketogenic diet. In fact, I got the same score when I tested on the 100 to 150 grams of carbohydrates per day. And the score I got was basically less than 25. So unfortunately, when you get this test done, if you're less than 25, they don't give you the specific number, because anything less than 25 is really, really low, and they figure your risk of insulin resistance is really low. You can see that a score of 27 is the 25th percentile. So basically, I was somewhere left of the 25th percentile, which is considered to be a low insulin resistance marker score. And the company, this is not FDA approved yet. The company claims that this is an early indicator of potential for insulin resistance, long before blood glucose values are starting to creep up. Well, it's company proprietary, and they don't tell you what they're using for this insulin resistance score. But, if I had to wager a guess, I'd say that one of the things they're using is the triglyceride to HDL ratio. And the other thing they're using is pattern B, which, is either elevated LDL-P or small dense LDL-P. Remember, they go hand in hand, they go together. So some combination of those things, those two parameters, more than likely is what's being used to predict potential for insulin resistance. Because remember earlier we said that discordant but bad, which predicts lots of particles, a high LDL-P and small dense particles, is common in insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. So I'll show you something else here that's kind of interesting. So if you don't have LDL-P testing, you have a standard lipid panel, so you have the concentration values instead. Well, the triglyceride to HDL ratio also predicts particle count. I'll show you some data on that in a minute. So if you have a triglyceride to HDL ratio of greater than 2, then it's more likely that you have an elevated particle count and small dense LDL particles, and it's more likely that you're discordant but bad. Okay, so that's something to be aware of. the goal is to have a triglyceride to HDL ratio that's less than 2. And when I got back to my normal way of eating and tested, this is what I got for my triglyceride to HDL ratio, 1.3, so significantly less than 2. So a little bit more on the triglyceride to HDL ratio. Here's some data. Looking at triglyceride to HDL ratio and LDL size. This was published in Diabetes Care in 2000. And you can see the relationship along this line that basically, as the triglyceride to HDL ratio increases, as that increases, LDL size decreases. Remember, we want large LDL, not small LDL. And so it's a pretty good relationship. High triglyceride to HDL ratio, especially over 2, predicts small, dense LDL particles and a high particle count and discordant but bad. What does that mean? That means that your LDL concentration may look normal, but you could still have a high particle count. So here's some data out of Sao Paulo, Brazil, published in 2008. And this is on the triglyceride to HDL ratio in cardiovascular disease. So this is looking at something called a hazard ratio. And a hazard ratio is sort of like a risk ratio. And a hazard ratio of, let's say, 3, for example, means that you're 3 times more likely to have cardiovascular disease. A hazard ratio less than 1 means that you're less likely to have cardiovascular disease. Okay, so let's look at some of these things. So this is a line that represents 1. So that means anything on this line has a hazard ratio of 1, which means it does not predict cardiovascular disease at all. Okay, no predictive ability at all. Anything to the left of the line is protective. So there's HDL, it's to the left of the line. That means if your HDL levels increase, you're less likely to get cardiovascular disease. So anything to the left of the line is protective or good. Anything to the right of the line is risky or bad, okay? So let's take a look at some of the values. So total cholesterol is pretty much right on the line, which means total cholesterol doesn't predict cardiovascular disease really at all in these data. Not a good predictor of cardiovascular disease. And I think a lot of you probably knew that. Now, what about LDL cholesterol? Well, we have to look at these bars right here. And this represents the 95% confidence interval. And what we normally say with hazard ratio data is that if the 95% confidence interval, if it crosses the line at 1, then it's not predictive. And so LDL-C, not really predictive of cardiovascular disease. Total triglycerides on their own, maybe a little better, but not really that predictive either. But what is predictive is this, the triglyceride to HDL ratio. So of all of those markers here, the most predictive of cardiovascular disease is a triglyceride to HDL ratio. And you can see that it has a hazard ratio of 3.31, which is a pretty big hazard ratio. So when you're looking at a standard lipid panel, not an LDL-P, but a standard concentration lipid panel, the most predictive value in there, the value that's most important is triglyceride to HDL ratio, not LDL, not total, not LDL to total or HDL to total or HDL to LDL. The most predictive value that you can look at in that standard lipid panel is the triglyceride to HDL ratio. And again, the target is less than 2. You want that value to be less than 2. Okay, so I want to wrap up by looking at a little bit of data on the change in total cholesterol on a ketogenic diet. And this is data often presented by Jeff Volek. This is some of Jeff Volek's data. And I've altered his figure just a little bit to make a point. Okay, so what does the data show for this group of individuals right here? So that group of individuals, when they go from a ketogenic diet, from a normal diet to a ketogenic diet, what happens to their average cholesterol values, their average total cholesterol values? Well, what happens is no change in mean cholesterol. So the average cholesterol value pre-keto and on keto was basically the same in this group of individuals. So as a scientist, if I'm looking at that, my conclusion would probably be that the ketogenic diet does not change total cholesterol values. But I'm going to show you something interesting here in the next slide. Well, this is Jeff Volek's actual slide and the raw data. And so, this is, pre-keto, and this is the change post-keto. And what you can see is kind of interesting that sure, the average change was 0, and that's only because the number of people that increased, or the amount of increase, is balanced by the amount of decrease. But almost everybody saw a change. So to say there's no change in total cholesterol on a ketogenic diet is just not correct, not on an individual level. And the point here is that, as scientists, we're interested in means, in group means or averages, but clinicians treat individuals. And right now, with the state of the science, we don't really know how you're going to respond to a ketogenic diet. We know how most people respond in certain circumstances, like, for example, people that are insulin resistant, most respond favorably, but we don't know in all circumstances. My response was a little bit unusual, and so we don't have the science yet to really be able to predict how every individual is going to respond. And so, the point being here that if you're going to try a ketogenic diet, it's really a good idea to test. I highly recommend the LDL-P testing, so you can really determine how your LDL-C is carried, and you've got a measure that really tracks well with risk. So I highly recommend LDL-P testing pre and post. Google it, you'll find out how to get LDL-P testing done. You can do it on your own without your doctor, although I do recommend getting your doctor involved. If you don't do the LDL-P testing because insurance does not normally reimburse it, it's about $100. Well, if you do the standard lipid panel, then the triglyceride to HDL ratio will give you some indication of what's happening with your LDL-P, because remember, it's a fairly decent predictor of pattern B, or small dense LDL-P. Okay. Well, there you have it. There's my experience with the ketogenic diet and a little bit about some advanced lipid testing. I hope you enjoyed it and found it interesting. If you have some questions about this, well, feel free to go over to my webpage at mikeprevost.com and hit me up on the comments section, or click the contact me box and shoot over a question, and I'll try to answer it the best that I can. Okay, thanks for listening.